Greetings, changelings. Booga here. A quick heads up that we had a microphone mishap in this episode, so Fetch's sound quality is not what we would have liked for about the first 15 minutes of recording. We addressed the issue after that point, so please forgive us this slight sonic aberration and your patience will be rewarded. All other acoustic artifacts are the product of the usual mishmash of messing with settings until things sound reasonably okay. Thanks very much, and now for the episode.
This is Changeling the Podcast.
Welcome to Changeling the Podcast, where you can walk with us through the hedge and where thorny is not a dirty word. Joining me, as usual, is co-host and special lost correspondent, Fetch.
Pleasure to be here.
And special guest, Pete Woodworth.
Hello.
Welcome back to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. It's always a good time.
So this is an interesting situation because previously you have joined us to talk about Changeling the Dreaming, which has been our bailiwick for the past 3 seasons. And now you're joining us to talk about a game that is simultaneously similar and yet rather different. And I have no follow-up. I thought we should get that out in the open.
No, that's pretty good. There was a lot of that was one of the things that came up early in the design discussions. I mean, I don't know if you want to dive right into it, if that's a good.
I would love to. I have so many questions, and I've been so embarrassed to ask them because I'm like, what if he doesn't have the answers, and I ask him all the questions?
Well, I mean, I don't know if I'll have all the answers, but I always want to make clear it was a team effort. I was by no means the sole writer, and I wasn't the developer on this one either. So, but I do tend to talk in the first person plural because all these books are a pirate crew coming together. It's very rare to have a solo person doing a book these days. So.
Well, you have joined us before and talked about your background, but for the sake of anybody who perhaps has not heard one of those episodes, can you tell us a bit about how you got involved with role-playing, and in particular, how you came to be involved with Changeling?
Okay. I've been a gamer since I was about 5 years old. My brother and I found strange dice when we were walking home from school one day, and we brought them to our babysitter, and we were like, what are these? And he was an older brother of one of our friends, and he was like, those are Dungeons and Dragons dice. And we were like, what's that? And he's like, well, you make believe and you fight monsters and stuff. And we were hooked, like, from that point on.
I feel like this is how you wind up in the world of Jumanji.
Yeah, I mean, it was very similar in a lot of ways. And he did like a kid's version of D&D for us when we started, and eventually we started playing like the full rules. And and I often wonder, like, he and his friends were like the only people in the neighborhood we knew about who were playing D&D, and none of their dice were missing. So like we often wonder who's like where those dice came from, as it were.
The hedge, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean,
I was resisting jumping into the jokes, but you've done it now, so we're here.
And like from there, though, like I became the perpetual GM for my groups for a long time because I learned that I loved reading role-playing games, but a lot of people like it's a lot easier to get people to play them if you say, I'll run it. So then I got
That's the truth.
I enjoyed it. I liked being the game master. I liked making up worlds and stories. I was already writing a bit. And then in high school, we got into the World of Darkness, and some friends of mine got into it, and then they kind of dragged me into it. And the game that hooked me was Mage, because I was in D&D. I was always a big wizard guy. I always liked magic systems and stuff. And then we got into LARP because we were theater kids, and also our gaming group started to grow as some of us started, like, originally it was your stereotypical group of middle school guys, but when we got into high school, we started like dating, so we wanted to have our girlfriends play, so like it got too big, so we started LARPing. And since we were theater kids, we dove all in on playing vampires in someone's basement and running around Philadelphia pretending to be vampires in secret in public. Then I decided that my senior year gift to my friends was I was going to run Changeling, because Changeling came out and I fell in love immediately. And I did. It just blew me away. I liked the World of Darkness. I was already a pretty big fan, but I just fell in love with it. As soon as I picked it up, I was like, I'm going to run this for everybody. But they didn't have rules yet. They announced they were doing a Changeling rule book for LARP, but it wasn't ready yet and wasn't going to be out in time. So I was like, you know what? I already have the other Mind's Eye Theater books. I'll just do a bare bones rule book. I'll just adapt the arts, the realms, and a couple other things. We'll just use regular rules for the rest of it. And I wound up making a 120-page single-spaced rule book.
That's a lot.
And, yeah, on my Lotus Symphony, on my old IBM 286.
Beautiful.
And my girlfriend at the time was like, you should send this to them. I'm like, they already have the book. Like, it's been announced. Like, what do they want this for? She's like, well, maybe they'll hire you for something else. This is really good. And I was like, finally, I was like, sure. Okay. And I mailed it. And we even took it to Kinko's, and she like hand colored some pages copied from the Changeling rulebook as chapter dividers. And like, it was the most amateur thing you can imagine. But like, and also they had a rule that like submissions had to be no more than 2 pages. And here I am sending this like 100 thing. And like, the thing was, I talked to Rich Dansky later. He's now a good friend of mine. He was the Mind's Eye editor at the time and developer. And the person who was writing the Changeling LARP book ahead of me had quit the week before my thing showed up. And they had found religion and they had burned their manuscript. And they had nothing. So Rich was panicking. Then all of a sudden, a mostly written book dropped in his lap. My wife likes to call it my issue timing. Because he's like, a week earlier, I would have thrown it out because we didn't need it. A week later, I probably would have hired somebody and have been underway working on a new draft. But like, you came at just the right moment when we were like, holy crap, what are we going to do? We need a book. Here's a book all of a sudden. Yeah. And so they hired me in secret because I couldn't tell anyone except my girlfriend. Because like, we're not going to pretend that you're going to keep that secret from her. But you can't tell like everybody in your game group. So my friend secretly play tested a Shining Host without knowing it. And then they liked what I wrote. And so I started working some more for them. And since then I've gone on to write for, I think I have something like 50 credits now. I've written for all the versions of the World of Darkness at this point. I've written for Dungeons and Dragons and Ravenloft. I've written for 7th Sea, The Expanse. I've written for Exalted, Trinity Continuum. Like I've been Shadowrun. So I've done a lot. And I've been really lucky. I've had a really great career writing for games.
This might be a loaded question, but have you written for V5?
I have not written for V5.
Okay, I didn't think so, but
I have not written for V5.
On a half topical and half self-indulgent note, I'm curious, what parts of New World of Darkness were you involved in? And on a less topical note, I'm curious, what did you write on Exalted?
I worked on the newest edition of Dragon Blooded for Exalted.
Really? What Fire Wrought? Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
It's a great book.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book. Exalted has been a favorite of mine. Like a while ago, I drew up a list of games that I want to write for, and I've just been trying to steadily use my contacts to try and work for all the game lines I've always loved. So Exalted was a big win for me on that one.
Nice.
As far as the New World of Darkness, I should backspace slightly and say that I haven't worked with Paradox. So, I mean, when I say New World of Darkness, I mean White Wolf's original New World of Darkness. So I was supposed to work for something for Paradox, and then that didn't materialize, which I can't really talk about. But I've worked on Changeling Lost, obviously, for first edition. I worked on Hunter the Vigil, first and second edition a bit, because Hunter's another game that's always been dear to me. I've done some work for Requiem. I wrote the LARP book for Requiem, and I also have written for a couple of smaller source books, like Guide to the Night and a couple others. So
nice.
Yeah.
When you say that you've written on them, I think there was one big thing I was curious about. I was re-listening to the previous podcast episode that you'd done with Puka and Josh. In that one, I thought you had said that you were the line developer for the LARP books for New World of Darkness. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, I was line developer and one of the main writers for Mind's Eye Theater and like the book Mind's Eye Theater for the New World of Darkness, and then Requiem. Since those were the only official books, like Mage got a sort of official book that Eddie put together that was good, but a lot of people don't consider it an official release because it was never out in soft or hardcover. But I mean, I don't think that counts, but I think it's still a book if it's a book.
Yeah. I mean, if it's sanctioned by the company, then...
Yeah, that's because people are like, well, it never really came out. I'm like, PDFs come out all the time.
Right, yeah.
I get it. I like physical books too. I'm old school that way. I like to hold a book in my hand. But
Well, that's when you go to Kinko's and print out 2 pages that have 60 sides each.
yeah.
We will get your thoughts on LARPing Changing the Lost, but beside your involvement in the Mind's Eye Theater aspect of what was then called the New World of Darkness and your other books, your work with Changeling, the Lost specifically, was that, quote unquote, just working as an author and a plate tester on the core book? Or were you also involved later on down the line? I know you weren't part of Paradox, but like...
Although it's funny because I've heard a friend of mine refers to it as the old world of darkness, the new world of darkness, and the paradox dimension, which just sounds really So I was like, that's a good way of like, he's like, I needed another way to say a different world of darkness, but like
really it should be the paradox realm if we're on
paradox realm would also work. But,
I like that paradox realm.
But yeah.
Anyway, back to questions.
Yes. Yeah. I worked mostly on the rule book. I was supposed to work on the autumn book, but I had just started graduate school and had to back out. So I did some of the outlining, like I was in on the outlining and the development process, and then I think I got partway through a first draft and I had sorely underestimated graduate school. So I went to the developer and said, I hate to bail, but I don't want to leave you hanging. So I think they used a little bit of my content eventually, but like that was just fine with me. It was, we were working on it together, but I didn't get a credit in that book, and I shouldn't have got a credit on that book because I didn't really finish it. But so I was privy to the plan that the developer had for releasing, like, because they had a whole plan for all their source books. Like they came in prepared for Lost. They had a vision for all the books they wanted to do and why they wanted them in that order and everything.
Well, and as we've talked about on a previous episode, the best laid plans, with Changeling getting too popular for its own good and getting the additional books. But
yeah.
But with regards to that design process, because I mean, separating out the design and the development, were you involved in, I don't know when it would have started, maybe 2005, 2006, the actual like laying of the foundation for what Lost would be, and what was that like?
I was in some of the early discussions because I made it very, very clear that I wanted to develop Changeling. Like I was hounding them as soon as the New World. I was like, if there's Changeling, I want in. If there's Changeling, I want in. Like I was known already as a very zealous Changeling guy among the White Wolf staff because I made sure that everything written about Changeling and LARP was written by me. So I wanted also to be consistent, but I also was just jealous, and I guarded my changelings. I was very protective of them in LARP.
That was the Cluricon moment to go with your issue moment.
Yeah, pretty much. I just, I wanted them treated right, and they often got the short end of it from the vampire LARPers and the werewolf LARPers. And but anyway, that's a different conversation. But the development process, I was in very early because I was a in-house person, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Like there are a lot of people we go to because most game companies have a very small staff, if they have a full-time staff at all. And so you get used to working with people that you like to work with. It's like directors in Hollywood. They have the actors that they like to work with over and over. Like developers have people that they like that they know will turn out good work and do good things. And so it was a small group of us, some in-house people and a couple of the freelancers that they wanted to bring in right away. And when it started, the developer, because it also changed development hands about 3/4 of the way through for the core book, just because of reshuffling and other stuff. But they came in with a very clear plan for what they wanted to do. And Changeling was a tough sell to a degree because it had a reputation. First of all, it didn't sell as well. I mean, nothing sold as well as Vampire. That Vampire was always leaps and bounds ahead of everyone else. And there was a very sharp, it was Vampire was the biggest, then a large step down Werewolf, large step down Mage, and then big step down everybody else. Oh yeah, it was very clear. The only place that Changeling performed really well was LARP because it's well suited to it. But trying to convince the company to give another shot to Changeling was actually a little bit of a fight. And one of the things that came up was they were using the fact that like Dark Ages Fae was really well received for the Dark Ages line. And you can see there's a lot of elements from Dark Ages Fae that kind of there's a lot of element of Dark Ages Fae that kind of come into the Lost. If you look over at that DNA, a lot of things like the idea that kiths are more sort of broad categories rather than a very specific thing is very Dark Ages Fae. The magic being a little bit looser, not quite as loose as Dark Ages Fae, but not like Arts and Realms, the very precise kind of changeling magic. And so that was sort of part of the pitch, was to sort of do a take on Dark Ages Fae in the modern world.
Oh.
Yeah, so there was a lot of, I mean, if you go back and look at Dark Ages Fae, it's a great book in general, but there's a lot of DNA that came from Dark Ages Fae and into it's. I tell people Changeling the Lost is more of a successor to Dark Ages Fae than Changeling the Dreaming, and also had a darker tone. It was a bit more weird and magical. Changeling's weird, but this was dark weird. Whereas Changeling is a little brighter. But
I'm curious what folks thought of that change at the time and what you think of it now. When I read the acknowledgements page on the CTL 1E core book, I saw this beautiful little transcript that reads, "Our greatest respects to those who came before us and made the word changing something that got people excited when they heard it in the World of Darkness context. This game was able to reach higher because of the foundation you built. This game's for all of you out there who love those old stories that change a little bit each time a new storyteller picks them up. We love them to enjoy." So it really did sound like it was meant as a successor,
oh
but
yeah,
I also know a lot of people were maybe like everybody was surprised when Requiem came out and they saw this isn't Masquerade.
yeah,
And then Werewolf and Mage diverged somewhat more.
oh yeah.
But I think once we got Changing the Lost, there was a pretty big change compared to what we got from the other games.
Yeah, and that was one of the things as a balancing act. We had how do I put this? The old World of Darkness was really played out. As much as we loved it, we were struggling to find what to put books out about. You know, we were joking that we were going to have the left-handed redhead guide to the Sabbat. You know, like we'd written so much, and the fans weren't necessarily super on board with us having world event progression books. Like
Oh.
they didn't necessarily want to buy into the storyline. Some fans were all about it, but a lot of people didn't pay any attention to the world storyline, so to speak, and they didn't like it when it intruded, as it were. Like if something changed, like clans going independent, like the Gangrel going independent or something, they were like, you know, I don't agree with that, so I'm just not using it. So we knew it needed to be very different, but we knew if it was too far, we'd lose a lot of our people.
Guilty.
Yeah, too close, and they'd be annoyed that it feels like we hadn't really done anything with it, and too far, and we'd lose a lot of people. And so there were a lot of discussions. The original plan was to make Requiem a lot even more different than it was,
Oh, wow.
and it kind of got brought back a little bit because like this might be just too far. We want people to be able to sort of recognize it, but have it be really remixed with a lot of its own perspective too. Requiem was deliberately designed to be a lot more local and a lot more like boots on the ground kind of thing, rather than the ancient jihad of the elders and the world spanning conspiracies. And there's still that if you want it, but it's not as much of the DNA of Requiem as it was of Masquerade. And so with Changeling, one of the things that consistently came back to us was that people were like, it's too happy, it's too bright, it's too bears with balloons. You know, that's the classic line that everybody uses on us, you know, is that it's too silly, even though if you actually play Changeling, as we all do, you know, it's probably the darkest and most tragic of all the games. One of the things that came up really early in the discussion was we wanted the new World of Darkness to have a very different identity. As they put it, like there was an article that Cynthia Summers wrote in the Mind's Eye Journal where she kind of nailed it on the head. It wasn't about this, but it was sort of on our minds, is the original generation of World of Darkness fans loved The Crow. And so a lot of the original players, that was one of their big inspirations, because it is the World of Darkness look. It's gothic and punk, you know, it's dark, it's rainy, it's supernatural, it's street level, it's gritty. And she said, you know, now, as she was writing in the early like 2000 or 2001, she's like, the new people coming in are influenced by Underworld and the Matrix. And I know the Underworld is its own conversation, but like she's like, they have a different taste. They're more about action than like gothic melodrama. And she's like, that's what happens is, just as different generations, quote unquote, of gamers find game worlds, they bring new influences with them. So we were thinking about that for Changeling the Lost. And one of the things that came up was, and this was a consistent quote unquote complaint, was that our changelings in Dreaming aren't really changelings in the classic sense, except the she.
Right.
They were like, yes, we're changelings in the sense that we're, fairy spirits hiding among humans and so forth. But like, we wanted to do something with that original idea of a changeling is somebody who's been stolen. And instead of having a fairy trying to live in the mortal world, we were going to have a human who had to survive the fairy world. And so we wanted to flip it around and look at it from that point of view. We wanted to really amp up the horror of it. Because Changeling has a lot of horror elements, like Dreaming has a lot of horror elements, but they're very different. And we really wanted to go with that really vicious fairy tale vibe, for lack of a better way of putting it. We really wanted people to see that, like, the Changeling story. There were some jokes that were like, are we going too far just to get back at the bears with balloons people? But like, we really wanted it to be something very different. So we figured flipping it around and having humans who've been changed rather than fairies who are hiding would be a very good way to do that. So that's kind of where it all started from, was that idea of let's flip the script around and let's take a look at the legend of the Changeling and see if we can do our own spin on it, update it a bit. What happens to the humans who were stolen, the babies who were stolen, if they come back?
Yeah.
And then we were like, well, what if they're not always babies? Like, that was also an early discussion. It's like, what if they weren't taken as children? What if they were just taken, at any given time?
And then you get kind of the whole alien abductee trope kind of folded into it as well with that.
Yeah, because somebody commented early on that like that's the alien abduction is the modern Taken by the fairies, and we played with that and the idea that people have been changed and altered or experimented on, and so one of the things that came up really early was we also wanted to have the Fae be really sinister,
right,
and make them very much like if we're going to have the Fae, we're going to have them be, because the true Fae, quote unquote, in Dreaming are off screen. They're the Tuatha, the Fomorians, like they're really not meant to be on screen ever, and they really don't have much of an impact on the game, really, unless you choose to make your whole game about them. So we wanted the Gentry to be really, really creepy and really, not only that, but actively involved in the world in terrifying ways.
I think you hit the mark on that very well personally, but I am curious, before getting into the details of your contributions into the book, how do you feel about the finished product of CTL? Do you feel like the team hit the watermark that they were looking for when that 1E rulebook rolled out?
I do. I do like some of the things that 2E did to it. The second edition did a lot of tightening. It did what second editions are good for. It clarified some things. It quietly ushered some things off stage that weren't really necessary. But I really liked what we came up with. And it was rough in a way because Lost got a very mixed reception. And we won any awards. We won a few other awards for it. Like, it's not that nobody liked it, but what hurt was a lot of the Changeling fans that we were talking to on like the old White Wolf forums and things didn't seem to like it. Because it wasn't more Dreaming, and they knew it wasn't going to be, but it was really not more Dreaming.
Yeah.
Because if you played in Masquerade, chances were pretty good you could figure out a way to convert that concept to Requiem if you wanted to keep playing, and carry over. You really can't do that with Lost. I mean, you can, like, technically I could make something that's like a Puka, but it's not, and it's not going to be like it. So, and the other games had that too. Mage the Awakening is very different than the Ascension. I mean, fundamentally, profoundly different.
I like that one even less.
I'm not a fan of Awakening. I respect it, but I like the original Ascension way too much. And I understand they're apples and oranges, but I just liked Ascension a whole lot more. I like the freedom that it had, but I think Awakening was a cool idea. It just didn't feel like Mage to me in the way that some of the other games did. Like Requiem still felt like vampire. It was very different, but it was still vampire. And Awakening felt like an entirely different game, which, to be fair, is what it was designed to be. It wasn't supposed to be Ascension in any way, but I liked Ascension, so it was hard. And hearing some of the Changeling fans really feeling like they felt kind of abandoned was really hard. That stayed with me.
I mean, I will apologize 20 years after the fact for my own reaction to that. But from my perspective, and I know I've held forth on this before, the line that I have dropped probably in every episode for the last several is I didn't love Lost until I stopped wanting it to be dreaming. But I think the root of that impulse comes from things that have nothing to do with the game and entirely around how Changeling the Dreaming was smothered to death. Let's not let's be honest about how it slowly faded away, and it still felt like there were so many stories left untold that for years people were like, okay, we want something to fill that void. But with Lost, like when it comes to things like mechanics or setting or whatever, I mean, the games are the games. What I wanted to ask was there any kind of conscious decision around themes and moods in particular about porting things or not porting things from Dreaming into Lost? Like, as we've been doing our read through the core book, something that keeps standing out to me is how the theme of duality is present in both games, but represented very differently. So things like that. I mean, was that part of the conversation?
Yes, it was a big part of the conversation, was how much, if any, dreaming do we want in this? And there were basically two different camps. They weren't completely firm all the time, but there's some people who were like, we should have some elements that carry over because we want to have those hooks, just like Requiem had. Some of the clans have the same name and the same role, but a lot of them don't, and like we condensed a whole bunch of clans, and some people really like that and some people hated it because some people liked a clean break because they were like, it's not Masquerade. It shouldn't have anything from Masquerade in it. It should be its own thing. And other people were like, well, it's nice to have some nods and carry over a little because that, shows continuity. It shows we're kind of winking to the long-term people as long as it doesn't ruin the people who've never played the original. Like, to not know what this reference is, why not do it? And eventually the developer came down with a pretty much, we really don't want to have anything from Dreaming in it if we want, because it's so different that we feel like it would just confuse it. Thematically, we're going for something very different here. And if we have elements from Dreaming, other than some very basic elements, like you said, there are certain themes that are going to carry over because when you deal with the Fae, when you deal with double lives and things, there's going to be some things that living between two worlds. Yeah. But it was very explicitly stated, like, we are not redoing Changeling the Dreaming. In part because the crew that came together to write Lost was a lot of people who were like, if we try to make this more dreaming, we're just going to disappoint everybody because it's not going to be what they want and it's not going to be new either.
I lean towards that being the right idea because I already encountered an issue with this recently with a good friend of mine, Elris, who loves dreaming, and he wanted to play in Changing the Lost, but kept getting caught up on what verbiage is already the same but means different things, like seeming, kith, mean completely different terms, even if they're otherwise the same.
Yeah, there were a couple things like the words like kiths. We auditioned some other words and nothing fit, and we're like, nothing had that. That, for love it or hate it, the World of Darkness splats, when they clicked. Yeah. Like clan and vampire gives you the right idea of this is a family, but family doesn't always get along. It and it's more familial. It gives that sense of literally blood relations. And tribe and werewolf gives you the right connotation. The splats, when they worked, they click really well. And nothing clicked. We tried a few different things. I don't remember what they were at this point. I just remember there was a lot of debates on terminology, and we're like, I think we're just going to have to use some of these, and maybe that'll be a little bit of a nod. But like, there was a lot of debate on whether we should do that. But we ultimately, some of them like Kith stayed in because we didn't have an alternative that we liked.
What's the one in Geist again? Is it Crew with a K or something?
Yeah,
Krewe. Crew is your group. Motley is still your set in Changeling, which has led to the most beautiful pun, of course, which is
Oh,
what
dear.
you get when you have a group
Yeah.
of, yes, Sin Eaters
Yeah.
and Changelings, a motley crew.
It's
Yep.
like there's nothing you can do about that joke. You just have to sit there and
Yeah,
let
you
it
just
hit
kind of
you.
you see it rolling towards you, and you just like, this is how I die. All right, fair enough. Um, and like glamour has always been associated with the Fae, so that was always going to be part of it. But
Yeah.
we felt like, in the early discussions for Lost and everything, one of the things that we really wanted to focus on was also this element of body horror that goes through Lost that Changeling really doesn't have. Even though you might be very different as a Fae, and your Fae seeming and your Famian compared to your human seeming, it's not really ever presented as something horrific.
Fundamentally, it's also not something that was done to you.
Yes.
In theory.
Yeah, it's who you are. You're just remembering who you really are. And that one of the things I think people really didn't lean into sometimes, or don't lean into as much as they should for Changeling the Lost, is that element of that body horror, along with the violation and of the kidnapping and this, service, whatever you were ordered to do for the gentry and your keeper. And like, there's so much room to do some really wicked, awful, wonderful, things to really underscore your character there. And I'm not generally a big body horror person, but I vibed with the body horror in Lost. I really liked how it was handled.
I'm glad you included it. As a trans woman, I've experienced gender dysphoria. And when I run Lost, one of the things I bring into the game is that vibe, since a lot of changelings wound up with bodies that they don't like for one reason or another. Usually it's pretty obvious, like, I don't like that I have big gnarly horns and a mouth full of teeth.
Yeah.
But it can be other things, like if your keeper decides, well, you know what, I just want to have a bunch of beautiful women, I'll kidnap this mortal. Oh, they look like a boy, well, now they look like a girl. And now later on they escape and they are still stuck looking at that and have to deal with that. Such radical changes are just part and parcel of what comes with being one of the Losts, and I think that makes the game a much stronger for being able to touch into those themes.
For what it's worth, I don't think you're by any means the only person who has appreciated along those lines. So
I was going to say, I've had some really interesting conversations over the years with other trans folks about Lost. And I've heard from, I'm not saying it's a representative sample, but just in talking to people, they were like, the game really vibed with them in the sense of that idea of being a way to explore dysphoria in a fictional environment that was safe, because it's fictional. And I had more than one person tell me that, like, before they even really knew their identity as a trans individual, they had like characters who appears to be mortal, but was masculine, but was changed into something very feminine by their keeper during their durance. And so this is their true self now, but their self they present to the world is still masculine, but their very seeming is. One person at Gen Con once was like, I realized, oh wait, I'm just trans. Like I'm not saying the Lost turned me trans. I'm not saying it was the only step of the journey, but it was like, they were like, it was a big moment for me to be like, why do I keep making characters like this? Why did I vibe with this character so much? I was processing some stuff there.
Can we retcon the name to Changeling the Egg?
Oh my god, that sounds beautiful. The crack Changeling the cracking.
The egg cracked. I'm trying to do a Lady of Shalott mashup in my head. And
the funny thing is too, is I've also had people say certain things from a different point of view in dreaming, is like, this is how I always see myself. The fairy seeming is how I always imagined I am. I always wanted to be a beautiful princess. And so like I play a she, because secretly I'm a beautiful princess. In my secret world with my friends, I'm this. But it's interesting because they come at it from like, I don't hear as much about like dysphoria as an idealized self with dreaming. Whereas Lost tends to be, by its nature, tackling some of the darker ends of identity struggle and identity realization. So it was interesting to hear over the years from people.
I'd also suggest that with dreaming, because, it meant a lot to me as a closeted teen to have that game. And I think that the concept of found family and community, it is present in both games, but in dreaming, I'd hazard maybe it's a little bit more uplifting overall.
Yeah.
Because Lost,
Changeling was one of the games where everyone was in it together. a lot of the time.
Yeah.
At the risk of us getting something which maybe at this point ought to turn into a theme episode, I want to say that you do get that, Pete, when you talked about how people find it being their true selves, that resonates a lot, I think, with the courts, especially the spring court in Lost, whereby you decide who is it that you want to be, forget what the keeper says.
Yeah.
And that can include you owning what you are now because you've come to identify with it, or it is what you've always been deep down. And that no longer belongs to the keeper, and they literally lose power over you if you're able to divorce some aspect of yourself from what they want from you.
Yeah. That's part of the power of the story, I think, with Changeling the Lost is one of my friends pointed out that the courts are basically, in Changeling the Lost, are basically different ways people process trauma response.
Mm-hmm.
Where you have Summer, like the angry, you'll never hurt me again, I'm going to fight people, I'm going to fight you. Autumn is sort of the exploration of like, well, if you've made me a monster, then I'll be a monster. I'm questioning, where does this take me from here? Winter is, you sit with your sorrow and your grief, and Spring is trying to embrace it, to own the label, and they're like, these are all, one of my friends is like, I'm not saying this is a psych textbook, but this is all different trauma responses. I'm like, well, that fits though. They've all been traumatized. Like,
yeah.
That's not explicitly why we wrote it that way, but lining it up is not surprising either. And they said, I like the fact that none of them are evil. And I said, yeah, that was another very deliberate choice. Like we tried very hard to not make the Unseelie aren't the villains of Changeling, especially because we saw in the old World of Darkness how limiting it was in the end to have the Cam and the Sabbat cannot coexist. They will fight, and kill each other, because it cuts off so many wonderful possible role-playing things if they're just kill on sight all the time. So we tried to make more nuanced games. That's why Requiem doesn't have that kind of dichotomy in it. It's much more interesting to let everybody potentially play together and then have any problems arise be ones that you deal with. Changeling the Lost was very similar. As we want people to, the Changeling the Lost has a community. The Lost come back, and there's literally no one else who gets them. Mm-hmm. And many of them can't return to their old life. I mean, the fetch was one of the early concepts that came on the table, and everyone just went, ooh. And it was so good. It was so much fun. I still have those emails when we were talking about the fetch, and like,
oh, can you forward them?
I wish.
As as like memorabilia or archival.
We when we were playing Lost and we were designing Lost, the fetches were some of the best stories that everyone had. Like I played a character. Some friends ran a Changeling the Lost LARP for us, and they were like, "You always run stuff. You get to play this time." So I played an ogre, and I was a Jack in Irons, which is a very obscure British folklore reference, but basically a fae that would wander the roads and capture escaped prisoners. So I was a bail bondsman. And the thing was, in my Durance, I went in as like, my character was like 5'7" and skinny, and came out as an ogre. So I came back, and my fetch is living my life, and I can't go back. I was a mama's boy from South Philly, and so my fetch introduced me as a friend from work. And so like,
oh, that's nice. They got along.
Well, yes and no, because I kept trying to muscle the fetch out of my life. And he's like, wouldn't your mom be heartbroken to lose her son? And every time I was getting aggravated, the fetch would be like, she sleeps right down the hall. And I'm like, if you touch her, it's like, what are you going to do? Beat me up? Put her baby boy in the hospital?
Ooh.
It was really intense. It was really good.
This is turning into a Wraith game.
Yeah, basically. And some people completely ignored the fetch. And that was also by design. If you didn't want to deal with it, you could have your fetch be gone. It could have been destroyed, could have been, but some people really liked the fetch as kind of that wraith aspect, like having your shadow be out and about.
Well, and it's interesting that you talk about the changelings not being evil per se, like by default, I guess. And yet the very first piece of text that we get in the first edition core book is this short story about a fetch being beaten to death. I mean, it does a great job because it really highlights a lot of these aspects of the Lost setting, distinctive aspects up front. But it makes very clear that this is a rough game.
Yeah.
And I know on previous episodes of like the Mage the podcast, we've had conversations about the nature of morality around things like that, like the justification of, oh, well, they're not really human. Does that make it better? Does that make it easier?
Yeah.
And those questions are kind of like bubbling up under the surface.
Yeah, and one of the frustrating things was like people gave Changeling the Dreaming crap for not being quote dark enough. Then we have
Right.
a dark Changeling game, and they're like, "Ooh, look who's all dark now." We're like, "Weren't you just the people complaining about this a while ago? Like, just say you don't like Changeling and just be done with it." Because like,
Right. Yeah.
we're not writing for people like that. We're writing for fans of Changeling. We're writing for people who might like the stories, but like you just can't win with some people because it wasn't dark enough. Now it's too dark. Now it's edgelord or whatever. And one of the things I found was interesting is one of my players was like, when they were closeted, they were like, the fetch is just me living my closeted life. The real me is real weird and real different. And I don't know how my family would react if they found out the person that's been living my life, quote unquote, isn't the real me. And I'm like, yep,
Yeah.
that's a layer. That's why it's there.
I've done that both metaphorically and literally.
And that's the thing is, and like one of the things we wanted is like we said, Changeling was always a game about fairy tales, and fairy tales are dark. And Changeling the Dreaming had a lot of darkness in it.
Yeah.
And that was what made it like it. I always said the only game that was darker than Changeling was Wraith, and nothing's darker than Wraith. Wraith is the blackest black. But Changeling, because I was like, everything good and wonderful you'll forget. You don't get to die heroically like Werewolf. You're just going to one day forget your best friends and all the adventures you had. And then you'll die. Like, yikes. And we said for Lost, like, this is a community of hurt people. And they're not going to have the same camaraderie that you see in a lot of Dreaming. They get each other, but one of my friends likes to say, they're queer as well, and they're like, nobody's as mean to the queers as the queers. And until we have an outside enemy, if the gentry come calling, the changelings close ranks because nobody generally wants anybody to be taken again. That's why it's like the ultimate betrayal is to help the gentry. But these are hurt people. They're not necessarily going to be able to deal with each other all the time really well.
You and your team did a fantastic job of balancing that. As I was going through the first chapter of the core book, I noticed that anytime the game would discuss any subject, like what's it like for a changeling to try to reclaim their old life, to start a new life, to socialize with other changelings, there was always a balance between here's how things go well and what they like about it, and here's where they struggle. So, for example, changelings in Lost, they have a hard time trusting each other because they struggle to know whether their perceptions are real or who's a loyalist versus someone actually against the gentry. But on the other hand, you have the concept of hospitality. And like you said, the idea that we're all going to come together to fight against the gentry when it comes down to it.
Yeah.
I'll mention to you in advance, Fetch, that for our recording on the core book, I have in my notes the phrase strategic essentialism underlined in capital letters in boldface. So we're going to talk about that.
And like one of the things with the gentry too is having the threat of some loyalists, because on the one hand, people are like, how could you? On the other hand, there are people who are willing to throw others under the bus just to maintain the life they have.
Yeah.
If you escape from your durance and you make your way back to the world, your life might be ripped up and tattered, but it's yours again. And then the hunters find you and you make a deal. You'll send somebody else back. If you keep informing on people, they'll let you keep this life here. A lot of people would make that deal.
There's a great note in second edition where first edition just outright says loyalists are bad, and they're kind of a kill on sight sort of deal.
Yeah.
In second edition, they say that while it's publicly decried, that on the other hand, most changelings are sympathetic towards privateers or loyalists because a lot of them have been in that situation themselves where they're trying to put their life together. The Fae comes knocking at just the wrong time, and in desperation, they cut a deal. And then hopefully they make up for it somehow, but it's complicated.
Yeah, and I do like that. That was one of the things I like that second edition I thought did really well, was make that a little bit more nuanced. Like we also with the original core book, we wanted it to be mostly from the perspective of most of the Lost, which is, oh, these people are awful, they're terrible, they sell us back to the Fae, into bondage and things. But we wanted to have a strong response, and then we were going to explore it in future books and be like, well, it's not always that clear cut. There's sometimes it is a question of, it's a terrible choice, but what are the gentry except terrible bargains? Like the Fae are known for their terrible bargains, and so it adds that element. And yeah, there's sympathy because everybody likes to say they'd never do that, but would you really? It takes a lot to live by your principles when your neck's on the line. It's very easy to say I'd never sell somebody out, but it's not as always easy to maintain that. And so we really wanted to look at that sort of thing too.
And it's interesting you bring that up in the context of second edition. So at PAX Unplugged a couple months ago, I ran the second edition Lost Quick Start at the role-playing room. And it kind of struck me, I hadn't even read through it before, but it struck me how that moral quandary is, without spoiling it, at the center of the story and the choices that the players have to make. And it is like a really drawn out, almost agonizing decision process. Whereas in first edition, I feel like all of the protagonists would be like, no, of course we're not going to sell someone out. Like, in that direction, given that Lost is now over, which is really hard to say, or at least for the time being, all of these sort of seeds that you planted, since you had to step back, do you feel that the game over the course of its arc kind of evolved in a direction you wanted or expected, or no?
Well, I mean, to be clear, I wasn't the developer, so that I wasn't the
Sure,
person with the overall plan. But
you had a lot of input, I imagine.
well, it was a team effort, and I definitely spoke up, and I definitely put my ideas in, and I did see a lot of them come to fruition. There were a few things, even little things, like some of the kits that didn't make the core book but showed up in some of the later books were ones that we had a big kit creation party, as it were, and then we kind of winnowed them down for the core book. But some of them were so good, we're like, we're going to put these in later. Like we have to.
I gotta ask. Yeah. I remember in your episode about the Shining Host, you had mentioned that one thing you tried to press for in the LARP book was the inclusion of cryptids, the modern fairies for America, and how those exist. And they said, no, that's way too different. You can't do it. So I'm curious whether there was anything specific in Lost that you got to include that you would wish that you had been able to include in Dreaming.
There were a lot of, like, one of the ones I liked was the idea of what became the book World of Darkness Slasher, which wasn't mine. It was another, but like, I've always been a fan of horror movies, and I thought like maybe there should be, as an enemy of changelings, like sort of some of these cryptids are urban legends and things. So like, the idea of an immortal slasher that comes after people and attacks people, I was like, that would make an interesting antagonist for changelings, because mortals are afraid of it and they dream about this psycho killer Jason Voorhees guy, and suddenly there's a chimerical Jason Voorhees chasing the changelings and murdering them. And so like we had this idea, and I was just a big cryptid fan, so I was like, they were correct. It was too far out there. It was too different, and they wanted to try and keep Mind's Eye Theater close to the tabletop so that people could move between them, and that, they weren't. I get enough crap for the blended Kith merit. Like, I get those. Those are still so controversial, where it's just like, giving somebody a birthright from another Kith and everything. But
gotta have your bog caps.
I mean, that was the thing about the reason I said Dark Ages Fae was such a big influence on Changeling the Lost is Dark Ages Fae, you basically built your own Kith.
Sure.
Based on a legend or a story. And in the timeline, the Kiths hadn't solidified yet into the modern dreaming Kiths. So they were still a lot more loose and reactive to mortals. And they took that for Lost. They're like, instead of the Kiths being the big splats, Kiths are just ways to interpret these legends and these stories. And you can just add Kiths if you want. Like, instead of making it a big deal, we made them much more accessible to players creating their own. They're not hard to make, a Kith that's pretty well balanced and thematic. And we covered a lot of ground, but we left it open to people. I think later on, if I remember, I think we put in a guide for creating your own Kith. But
Well, the penultimate Lost book had like what 40.
Oh
like
yeah,
that.
that too.
So
They kind of emptied the drawer at that
yeah,
point.
yeah.
I think my favorite one that made it eventually was the Razor Hands for the Darklings. Those
Oh
were
yeah.
because that was close to the slasher idea, and I really liked that.
My long running character was a hell diver, so they're near and dear to my heart.
Ooh, nice. Yeah, and with Lost, like the thing that I was proudest of was creating the hedge. So
You were the driving force behind the hedge.
well, they knew they wanted a dimension between our world and the Fey world, and so that was always on the table. And they wanted they're like we want to have an in between, because one of the driving things that inspired a lot of Lost was Neverwhere.
Right.
One of the things you notice is that it definitely got downplayed because it was a muted reaction from the crew. Some people really liked it, some didn't. Is that in the Lost, the changelings often have titles, or they talk about changelings having titles, but they were much more. It wasn't the hierarchy of the dreaming. It was more like Neverwhere, where it's like, this is the king of St. Mark's Station, and this is the Lord of London Below, and this is, like they make up these fanciful titles for themselves. And it was much more of that. It was more of an affectation than a true like nobility, as it were. But we were coming up with like what they wanted, and I was talking to the developers, talking to the rest of the team, and like, what do we do? And I was just reading something about hedgerows in like Normandy and France and stuff, and just these ancient thickets, these incredibly impenetrably dense, centuries old in some cases, hedges. And originally we were going to call it the hedgerow. That just didn't work. And they wanted it to be kind of like a maze or a labyrinth. Like navigating it was not easy. It was not fun. There was a bit of Guillermo del Toro in there as well.
Mhm.
Of course.
And so I was like, what if it was like passing through? Because if you try to go through one of those hedges, if you can even get through, you're going to be ripped up and you're going to be torn and tattered when you get to the other side, because it's just so dense and all so thorny. And you can sleep in some of those. They're insulated. Like they're so old that you can like sleep in inclement weather and not get wet. Like they're so dense. So originally they were like, what, like a giant hedge maze? I'm like, I mean, not necessarily literally, although part of it might be, but like just this idea of this ancient dense thing that has grown between the worlds, like a natural barrier. So I said hedgerow, and eventually they shortened it to hedge because hedgerow just wasn't working. And then that's why the cover has the thorn.
Right. I was going to say you have a built-in aesthetic with it too, like right there.
And as we talked about the Lost, we're like, they're all coming through ripped up. They're torn, they're tattered, they're bruised, they're cut. And so this is a good metaphor. You have to push your way through this thing, and you have to really want it to get through one of these things.
Yeah.
If you can at all, and you're going to come out bloody on the other side.
Ripped away.
Yeah. And so, a lot of things are being torn away. I remember telling someone a while ago, but like that's why it's impaled, and they'd never noticed the thorn somehow.
Oh, on the moth. Yeah.
On the moth. And they're like, wait, what? I'm like, yeah, the moth is impaled. They're like, it is? I'm like, yes, look at it. They went back to their bookshelf like, holy shit, it's like this thing's dead. I'm like, yeah, that's kind of the idea.
Yeah. Well, so I have to ask, and this will be my last question because we're getting near time, but are there any other specific contributions? Because I think both of us, when you said, oh, I did the hedge, we both went, like, internally.
Well, like I said, it was fine-tuned by other people. It was but some of the impetus from it came from me, yeah.
Well, all right. Are there any other specific contributions that, even if they were team efforts, you are particularly proud of your contribution to it?
I am proud. I did the original merits and flaws section. So
nice.
If you like or hate any of that, then the blame is, or the credit is me.
Gotta love the hollow.
Yeah, see, that was one of my favorite things. Is like, I was like, what if you carved out? Because I told people, like, people have carved out sleeping spaces in the hedgerows and things, and I was like, what if this is your equivalent of sort of like a freehold, but it's a little more dangerous, it's a little more wild, because we're not trying to recreate dreaming. So these are thorny places, literally and figuratively. So I'm proud of the merits and flaws. I did help with some of the discussions on the fetch, because originally it was going to be that the fetch was, all fetches were basically programmed to kill you on sight.
Oh, wow.
A lot of them do react that way, one way or the other, because you are a threat to their existence. You are also the realization that they realize they're not real. Because originally the idea was that the fetch never knows that it's not real.
Right.
That it's not actually the person. And so the realization, seeing the changeling triggers this primal impulse of destroy it to maintain the fiction. And you can still do that. We'd had a fetch that reacted like that, but we softened it a bit because I'm like, look, that, again, the kill on sight thing doesn't leave people a lot of room to interpret and do some horror. We can say that, yeah, some of the fetches immediately will basically have a psychotic break and attack. But what if some of them bargain? What if they have always suspected there's something wrong and they don't know what it is? And, the developer was like, I don't really want people to team up with their fetch. Like, I don't want that element of the story. Like, and so we're like, okay, well, maybe not like super friends, but, can you have a detente like me and my fetch, where I can't take my old life back because I don't look like me anymore.
Right.
Ma would never mistake me for her son. And I don't want to break her heart. So if I get rid of the fetch, then she's convinced her beloved son is dead or missing or whatever. And that's going to tear her up. So we kind of came to an accord. I'm like, I'll let you live if you keep her happy. Basically but it was an uneasy piece, as I've described.
That, I have to say, I think that's more elegant and involved than 95% of the fetch backstories I think I've seen. So.
That was over the course of a chronicle. So, I mean, we developed it well as it went on. But, man, they really twisted the screws on me on that one.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
And that was the fun part, I enjoyed that. But again, the fetch was designed also, if you don't want to deal with it, it might have been gone, or maybe you destroyed it when you first came back and took over your old life again, if you could, right. So the players who didn't want to have to deal with it didn't have to. It's not like the Shadow where it's a fundamentally integral part of the game like it is in Wraith. But if you wanted to run with it, man, you could find some really fun stuff to do with it. And that was a blast to do that. I love it.
And this was in a LARP, correct?
Yes.
So speaking of LARPs, I think Fetch has a question about LARPs.
Yes. My last big question for you, which is,
yeah.
As you said earlier, you were the line developer for the LARP rules for what was then known as the New World of Darkness, and for Requiem. There was the official but never put out in a physical book, Mage, Werewolf. I'm showing that was on the list but was canceled.
It was canceled, yeah.
I'm curious whether there was, kind of a multi-part question, whether there was ever a plan for a Changeling LARP book, what you think that might have looked like if it had come to be?
It was pitched by myself, and it was also pitched by someone else at different points in the lifespan of the New World of Darkness. Essentially, what happened was Mind's Eye Theater sales never came back to what they were. Mind's Eye Theater was never a huge selling thing. It definitely survived, but it was never a big success comparatively. And the numbers for Mind's Eye Theater and Requiem, the New World of Darkness books, were not where they needed to be to justify more expenses. Awakening got its book because, again, it was basically Eddie's passion project because he loved Awakening and he wanted to bring it to life. And so he basically made that happen by force of will. And he also basically was like, you don't have to pay me, I'll just do this, essentially. Okay, I don't want to speak for Eddie. I don't know the ins and outs of that whole project, but I got the impression that he was doing a lot of it just because he wanted to do it. But with Changeling the Lost, I definitely wanted to do it because Changeling was always the second best-selling LARP book for White Wolf once Changeling was out. It was Vampire was first, and then Changeling, then Werewolf, and then everything else. And I said, there's a lot that we can do here. It still has some of the Changeling elements of, you could be in your human seeming if you want to try and go walk around in public and play, which is a key part of a lot of World of Darkness LARP, is the idea that you can LARP incognito. Or you can go full Fae. If you're back at home and you want to do makeup and prosthetics and costuming and stuff, you can get some real freaky looks. And because of the way the kits are open to interpretation, people can really go wild with their ideas. I said, when I pitched it with a very Neverwhere vibe. I'm like, this kind of ragtag collective. I think people would really resonate with it. I think it naturally suits LARP in a lot of ways. The powers aren't too hard to translate to LARP. Some of them would have to be changed or dropped, but they're definitely not as potentially tricky to adapt as Arts and Realms for dreaming. We tried. Oh, Lord, we tried. I think we mostly succeeded, but every once in a while I read some of the Shining Host books. I'm like, wow, we were really reaching on that one. Okay.
At least you didn't have unleashings to contend with at the time.
Yeah, that's true. And so we pitched it, and it was pitched, like I said, it was pitched early on. And then when I finished graduate school and was coming back, the line was kind of on hiatus for a little while. And I said, are we thinking about it? And they said, like, look, the LARP is just not where it needs to be. Like, we're not really going forward with LARP, because the biggest supporters of the LARP were always the CAM, or the Mind's Eye Society, as is now.
Mm.
And they moved to their own rule books. I mean, they've been using their own rule books, but they basically kind of cut ties, and they're like, we're just going to make our own house rules. And I have a little bit of a chip on my shoulder about that, but that's a story for another time. So
adding it to the recording schedule.
We bent over backwards to accommodate them on Requiem, and they ditched us, and I'm still bitter about it. So
when you say they, I'm sorry, I got a little confused.
Oh, the Camarilla live action fan club.
Oh, okay.
Not that I'm not saying everybody in the Cam is a terrible person. There's a lot of great people, but they wanted us to make Requiem for them, and we obliged as much as we possibly could. Like, there were Cam members who have credits on Requiem, because one of them got a co-development credit, which I was not told about till the book.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm not happy about that, but the way that they were basically like, we're tired of using our own house rules. We want a book that we can use because we want to support you guys. And I was like, I don't think we should write for them, because they run 300-person games. Rules are just not going to work. Like, I write for small house games and small convention games, because that's how most LARPers play, in my experience. And I'm like, rules that work for 300 people aren't going to work for 30, and vice versa. So they're going to wind up house ruling it. And the decision was made to make them happy and to work with a lot of their input. And we made some decisions I didn't want to make to try and accommodate them, because they made requests. And then 6 months after Requiem came out, they said they're using their own rulebook.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I did not.
They have their own side of this. I'm sure I'm the villain of many a Cam chat from back in the day. But they also changed some things in the final draft that I didn't get a chance to look at. And I was the line developer, so I was a little bit annoyed.
Wow.
They changed some stuff and didn't tell anyone. Because when certain things came to print, I was like, where did this come from? And like, oh, the cam guy changed them. I'm like, why? And how was he allowed to change the final draft without telling me? So anyway, sorry. That's
water into the bridge.
Yeah. I mean, really, yeah, at this point, like, at the time, I was also frustrated because Mind's Eye Theater was ending. And I had put a lot of time. I was the Mind's Eye Theater developer for a couple of years before the change to the New World of Darkness. And I was really excited to try and rebuild it from the ground up for the New World of Darkness. And then, yeah, it was a rough time, because I wanted it to keep going, and it just wasn't going to keep going.
Well, I, for one, would like to think that you have made the most of that situation and moved on to bigger and better and hopefully fulfilling things. This is shamelessly my segue into saying, if we have no further questions about Lost, would you like to update us on anything that you're working on that maybe we would like to be informed about?
Well, I mean, if you don't have any further questions, that's fine. That's fine.
I don't know if you have any other.
I'll keep this one brief. Putting aside, if at all possible, the Mind's Eye Society aspect of it, did you take any interest in the CTL LARP scene? I know I saw one at a convention, but I had no idea whether that was something that was affiliated with the Mind's Eye Society or something that some random people.
As far as I know, I don't think Mind's Eye Society ever did Lost. I think that was all local stuff. I didn't really, outside of my friend group, I didn't really get anything. I didn't get into the Lost scene because it also was around the time when I moved away from doing as many public LARPs and only really LARP with my friends at this point and things like that. So, that's where my head was at that point in time. So I do think it is a great game. I do think it can be LARPed and LARPed well. I've seen people do it well. I've seen a lot of people nowadays also mix elements that they like from Dreaming and Lost for homebrew LARPs, which I think is a really good idea. There's one around here that does that, or at least it seems to. I was reading their page, where they take some of the ideas from Lost and some of the ideas from Dreaming. Even my wife and I were running a long-term Changeling game for years, a Changeling Dreaming LARP kind of updated with our own house setting post Time of Judgment, and we wound up introducing the Lost eventually as like a new emergence from Arcadia, and that was kind of fun to explore, combining the two. It was still more of a dreaming game, but we found a way that we like to introduce characters who were basically the Lost, people who had been changed and were then released because the dreaming was sort of crumbling. And
I love that.
there were people out of time. Some of them had been there for centuries, so they came back to a world that didn't know them, and they didn't know it. And it was an interesting experience. We had a few people play them, and they had fun doing the anachronistic thing. So yeah.
That's it from me.
Okay.
Awesome.
As far as projects go, I mean, right now I'm working on a couple things for Green Ronin for the Expanse game, the tabletop game. I'm really excited about that. I love the Expanse. I love the novels. I love the show. So working on the Expanse has been an absolute dream because the authors of the books have to sign off on everything. So I've gotten notes back like, hey, by the way, you really like this idea that you had in the rulebook.
So cool.
Yeah, it makes me giggle every time. Like, it was like when I worked for Star Wars back in the day, like the old West End game Star Wars was one of the first things I ever worked on. And they had to run everything by George Lucas, literally.
Wow.
And I got a note back because he wanted to know what was going on in Star Wars. Even though the game wasn't canon, he was still always curious for good ideas. And the idea was that like nothing was canon until it was in a movie. Even the books were never canon. But my editor gave me back a note, George likes your planet. And I was like, I lost my mind because I was writing about new planets to explore and stuff. And he's like, George really liked your planet. I was like, he read it? He's like, yeah, he reads all this stuff.
So cool.
He's the biggest Star Wars fan. I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense.
I mean, that's capital A achievement right there.
Yeah, exactly. Like even when like the fandom sort of turned on Lucas and stuff later on, I was like, this is still one of my proudest things. This is like George Lucas liked my planet. So
Frame that.
Yeah, but I'm also working on a LARP project right now. It's probably going to take a year or two to get off the ground, but I don't know what to call it. Kind of an experimental LARP called Tomorrow We Burn.
Is it Nordic?
No, not really. I mean, it's very freeform, but it's more American freeform than Nordic. But
okay,
it's basically a one and done. It's not like a campaign LARP, but it's about censorship and oppression and being yourself in a time when people want to kill you for being yourself. And so
you can't imagine what that's like.
So it wasn't as of the moment when I started thinking of it, and then but it's going to be an interesting experience. So like that's like I said, it's a small game. It's designed to run over the course of a single weekend and be very dramatic.
I mean, I'd hazard to say it's always been of the moment. It's just more openly so now.
Well, true. That is true. That is a good way of that is a good clarification there.
I'm curious to know more about that as it comes. Okay. Where can we keep updated about
Well, right now it's in a very private section because I'm still developing it. So it'll come up on my webpage when it's more ready. Right now it's basically in pre-alpha, like talking it over with a few friends, trying to figure out like, will this work? Can this work? You know, is it possible to do this game the way I want to do it? Like, can we find a site that will have it? But when I can go, quote unquote, go public with it, I'll be updating it on my website. And the last thing I'm working on is a little duo game using the Lumen system, which is a really cool little indie tabletop system. So a guy named Spencer creates it in Gila RPGs. I'm working on a game strictly for 2 players about one character is the last heir of a doomed dynasty, and the other person is a spirit bound into their blade, because I kept having to cancel game nights, except 2 of my players were always there. So I'm like, let's just write a game for 2 people. And the GM is the cursed sword that is trying to destroy them both. But they need to try and fight back the darkness in their kingdom. So kind of a Castlevania vibe, I guess you could say. So I'm working on that. That's kind of fun. That's still very early sketches, but I'm having fun with it. It's called The Blade Itself. So that'll also go up on my website when it gets closer to release.
Just as a reminder, is it peterwoodworth.com?
Oh, sorry.
Or has that changed?
No, it's still peterwoodworth.com.
Okay. I know it's positively Woodworthian, but I remember that it is not positively woodworthian.com. Yeah.
Currently, the front page story is my takedown of the Polish trailer park LARP. So, yeah, it's an interesting one. People cosplaying as poor Americans, and
oh no.
Yeah, I have a lot of complex feelings about it. Why I wrote a post about it, but
listeners, go forth and read it.
Yeah, it's an interesting. I got into a huge argument about it with my European LARP friends, and like They made a lot of good points. I'm not saying that it shouldn't exist, but I have some issues with how it's coming together.
Yeah, that sounds. Well, we will put the link in the show notes, and
All
listeners can draw their own conclusions.
Yes, exactly. They can feel free to draw your own conclusions there.
In the meantime, if you would like to get in touch with us here at Changeling the Podcast, here with all of the other links at Discord, you can reach out to us at discord.me/CTP. You can email us at podcast@changelingthepodcast.com. We are, for the time being, on Facebook, and probably there will be a blue sky by the time this launches. I keep saying that, but I need to just make it happen. Mastodon is dice.camp/@changelingpod, and we are on Patreon and YouTube under Changeling the Podcast. I think I got all the links, but Pete, thank you so much, because it is always a joy to talk to you and just delve into the secret histories.
I'm glad to
It's
do
been
so.
a pleasure.
It's kind of fun.
I've learned so much today.
Yes.
One of the things, I was talking to Rich Dansky the other day, and he's like, yeah, there's so much like that people never knew about the games that they play, and he's also obviously a very successful video game writer, so he's behind the scenes in that industry as well. And he's like, if you ever wondered why, like, people are like, why did this happen in the World of Darkness, especially the original World of Darkness early on? He's like, we were 22. Like, the oldest person was like 29. Like,
Ancient.
like, it seemed like a good idea at the time, was kind of our raison d'etre.
30 is practically an antediluvian.
Yeah. And so he's like, so that's also why in Changeling, you're dead at 25.
Right.
Like, you're dreaming. Like, your soul is burned out by 25. Because we could not conceive of being that old.
I mean, I still can't, but anyway. All right.
All right. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. I've been Puka.
And I've been Fetch.
And until next time, insert Led Zeppelin lyric about hedgerows here.
Until next time, let's be glad that we found the Trod back.
Yay!
Yay!
Or did we?
With regard to whether it's possible for Changeling the Dreaming and Changeling the Lost to be unified in terms of themes and setting, this conversation really illustrated to us that the best approach is to handle individual elements rather than mashing everything up wholesale. To that end, we present to you the Bear with Balloons Hedgebeast, a dire creature that stalks the trods of the lost. Dressed in threadbare circus finery, the bear offers its balloons as prizes for a riddle contest. Made from a material with an uncomfortable resemblance to human skin, each balloon functions as a token which allows for jumping outrageous distances but makes the bearer lightheaded and easily confused. Losing the riddle contest means instead that the bear will immediately attempt to devour the challenger in a ravenous fury of venom and foam. Sometimes the bear senses a kindred spirit in a changeling and simply hands them a balloon for no apparent reason, because that's the Fae, and sometimes the bear is just a sore loser who goes in for the kill anyway, because that's the Fae also. For other observational notes on such creatures and the hedge ecology that frames them, we suggest you stop by our hollow at www.discord.me/ctp to join in the conversation. You can also support our show by signing up at www.patreon.com/changelingthepodcast, joining the esteemed ranks of our capital P patrons who get a shout-out each episode like so. Bad Company, Derek, Dorcadus, Elris, Hugo the Bogperson, Ia Bull, Jason Vines, Oreo, Razcaboose, Sandchigger, Sija, and Simon Strand. We also welcome reviews on the podcast listening platform of your greatest convenience, and do tell your friends and foes alike about our show if you've a mind to. With that, be well, glamour strong, and keep on dreaming.